Haunted Ohio by Chris Woodyard. Volume 1, Chapter 10. Our Haunted Presidents. The Harrison Horror to Hoarding's Doom. In the democracy of the dead, all men are at last equal. There is neither rank nor station, nor prerogative in the republic of the grave. The Harrison Horror. In his Devil's Dictionary, the acid pen of Ohio author Ambrose Bierce defines a grave as grave, noun, a place in which the dead are laid to await the coming of the medical student. For the descendants of William Henry Harrison, 9th President of the United States, this would have been a grim joke indeed. Harrison died in 1841, a month after taking office, and was buried in North Bend. On May 28, 1878, his son, the Hon, John Scott Harrison, died suddenly at his home in Cincinnati, and was laid to rest with all the pomp due a United States Senator. The remains, wrote the Cincinnati Commercial in addramation, were enclosed in a handsome metallic casket with heavy silver handles. But Old Hickory must have spun in his grave and at subsequent events. On May 31st, 1878, commercial subscribers were stunned to read, "We have never been called upon to speak of a more shocking outrage than that of the robbery of the grave of Hon John Scott Harrison. But yesterday the commercial contained a report of his funeral services. His remains were carried by old citizens who were his near friends, and placed in a spot sacred to the history of the country. The grave was prepared with extraordinary care. Iron casket was placed in masonry and covered with an immense stone and cemented before the earth was thrown in. It was ascertained that the son of a poor widow, actually Benjamin Harris's cousin, Augustus Devon, had been removed from his grave in the neighborhood, and one of Mr. Harrison's sons came to the city on the generous errand of seeking the body of the widow's son, and not knowing the desecration of his father's grave, found that honored father of the Ohio Medical College with a rope around his neck until wanted in the dissection room. It is doubtful," clucked the paper, "whether the law would be allowed to take its course in case the guilties were speedily discovered." General Benjamin Harrison, born at North Bend and later our 23rd president, is in the city and is resolved to ascertain who are responsible and to cause their punishment. Unfortunately, outrage of this sort were commonplace. Medical students needed specimens for their anatomy classes, and were limited by the law to the bodies of tramps and paupers. But there were never enough bodies, which meant that the resurrectionists, as they called themselves, had the market in dead bodies virtually sewed up. They had to work fast before the body decayed and became worthless for dissection. After the mourners had gone and the watchmen were looking the other way, as were frequently paid to do, the loose dirt was shoveled out, and the coffin lid ripped off. Silver handles and nameplates were pried off and pocketed. A sharp hook was plunged into the stiff flesh under the corpse's chin, ensuring the vital internal organs the students needed to study would not be damaged. Then the resurrectionists climbed into their winch and cranked the corpse out of the ground. And the body was dumped into a sack, and the resurrectionist replaced the coffin lid, the dirt, and as many signs of their desecration as they could while hurrying in the dark. To avoid detection, corpses were often preserved in brine and shipped out of state in barrels marked pork or beef. Otherwise, students dissected at full speed, first skinning the head and removing scars or other distinguished marks that would help identify the body if they were raided. On June 1st, 1878, a full page of gruesome details was released under the heading, "That Horror, the theft and finding of J. Scott Harrison's corpse." The body was, in medical parlance, in pickle. That means immersed in brine after an injection of chlorine of lime into the veins for preservation during the summer. The janitor of the medical school was implicated and arrested. The $10,000 bail was posted by a faculty doctor, Benjamin Harris, in an interview printed in the June 1st commercial, condemned the facility of the medical college. They say they were shocked about it. They have the guilty parties under their wing. If they do not point them out, then they themselves are responsible, as if they themselves had been guilty of the outrage. Following this interview was a testy rebuttal from a representative of the faculty, expressing regret for the mistake, but complaining of a shortage of bodies for the anatomy room. Said the doctor, "The men engaged in the business of procuring subjects are, of course, unknown to the facility. They bring the material to the college, receive the stipulated price, and disappear as mysteriously as they came." After naming the shiftless Bob Roundtree, whose record is not the best, as the possible resurrectionist, the paper goes on. If cemented walls, carefully and skillfully conducted and constructed, and vast weights requiring the strength of many men to lift, and prepaid watchmen could not save their loved and honored parents' graves from the desecration and dishonor, what could? This is the question that many people have asked themselves in the last 24 hours. What can we do to save our loved ones and lost ones from the indignity of chute and windlass and dissection knives? The paper envisioned a grisly scenario. It was not pleasant to meditate that the body of the mother whose brine and nourished him and who he loved and he revered was liable to be hooked under the chin and dragged from its last resting place and carted through the streets naked by ruffians, and hauled up the well in the medical college and exposed to a knife of careless, reckless young students who carved the sacred remains with pipe in mouth and ready to jest and laugh on the tongue. Such horrific passages were why many Victorian women were forbidden by husbands and fathers to read the newspapers. Appalling though the details were, no doubt Papa would have been equally shocked at the notion of the students smoking without permission in the presence of lady, even a deceased one. As a result of public outcry, stiffer laws were passed against resurrectionists. The body of John Scott Harris was once again quietly laid to rest. For the rest of his life, Benjamin Harris could hardly utter the word father without reliving the anguish produced by the Harrison horror. The Lincolns and spiritualism. The Ohio connection. Was Abraham Lincoln a spiritualist? That question has been asked ever since the 16th president attended seances in the White House and had recruited reoccurring dreams and visions, including one of his own death. Soon after Lincoln was elected president, he was shown an article in the Cleveland Plan Dealer that hinted that he had accepted the possibility of spiritual communication. He said in reply, "This article does not begin to tell the wonderful things I have witnessed. Half of it has never been told." Some of the wonderful things that he witnessed included a levitating piano and a message from Daniel Webber through medium Nettie Colburn Maynard that Lincoln should issue the Emancipation Proclamation. When news of this seance was publicized, a citizen of Ohio, David Quinn, wrote an indignant book called Interior Causes of the War, the Nation Demonized, and its president a spiritual rapper. A spirit rapper. That makes more sense. The Plain Dealer also told the story of a medium named Coughlin, who, at a reception in Cleveland, recognized Lincoln as a client who used to come alone, sit silently, question mentally, and depart as he came, unnoticed. Conklin told of how Lincoln received a spiritual message from a friend who he had left recovering from an illness. He had no idea that the friend had died until his friend's death was confirmed the next day. If Lincoln was reputed to be a spiritualist, his wife Mary Todd Lincoln was a confirmed believer. While Mrs. Lincoln showed an interest in spiritual communication, it wasn't until after the death of her son Willie in 1862 that an Ohio woman, Lizzie Keckley, introduced her to the mediums of Washington. In the 1860s, thousands of Americans tried to raise the dead during the war that took a horrendous toll in young life. During these years, one of Mrs. Lincoln's closest friends was Elizabeth Kinkley, a mulatto seamstress who wrote the first Backstairs at the White House book, much to the horror of Miss Lincoln and her sons, who felt betrayed by the book's intimate confidences, harmless though they seemed to us. Kinkley was an ex-slave who sewed for the Varian Davis, wife of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and other eminent ladies who introduced her to the First Lady. Tall, regal, and ladylike, Kinkley had excellent taste and reasonable prices, traits which endeared her to Mrs. Lincoln. After weathering some of Mrs. Lincoln's rages and whims, Kinkley became a trusted friend and confidant. Mrs. Lincoln described her as, although colored, very industrious, very unobtrusive, and will perform her duties faithfully. Mrs. Kinkley's son, who attended Wilberforce University, had died during the Civil War. The anguished mother turned to spiritualism, hoping to connect to her dead son, linked as they were by the losses of their sons. Mrs. Lincoln eagerly allowed Miss Kinkley to introduce her to the spiritualists of Washington. Mrs. Lincoln desperately wanted to believe that Willie was close by, as she told Charles Sumner, "A very slight veil separates us from the loved and the lost, and to me there is near comfort in the thought that though unseen by us, they are very near." She told her sister, Emily Todd Helm, that Willie came nearly every night to stand smiling at the foot of her bed. At a séance arranged by Miss Kinkley, Miss Lincoln saw the spirit of Andrew Jackson, who told her that he was now Willie's guardian, and that she should not trouble herself any more. From that day forward, Mrs. Lincoln grieved a little less for her dead son. In later life, Miss Elizabeth Kinkley settled in Xenia and presented several relics of the Lincolns to Wilbur University. The Phantom Funeral Train. Lincoln's funeral train passed through Ohio on its melancholy journey to the president's final resting place in Illinois. At Cleveland, the body lay in state in a Chinese pagoda of black velvet sprinkled with silver stars. In Columbus, the casket lay under the cupola of the State House and rode on an ornamental Oriental temple-style hearse with roses scattered under its wheels, accompanied by floats with young ladies in black scarves ensconced among branches of evergreen, a kind of funeral Rose Bowl parade. The train stopped at Urbana in darkness. A pilot car, beautifully draped, had preceded the cortege the whole way to make sure that no obstruction should endanger the train containing the remains and the escort. A gun was fired at intervals while the people stood in the light and bonfires, blazing torches in perfect silence, gazing at the pilot car. At the end of 15 minutes, it moved off into the darkness, and the next moment the train came in just as slowly and noiselessly. After 15 minutes, the train moved quietly away, leaving the people more aware than ever of the great calamity. As reported in Albany Evering's News, Lincoln's train still travels those tracks. Regularly in the month of April, about midnight, the air on the track becomes very keen and cutting. On either side of the tracks it is warm and still. Every watchman, when he feels the air, slips off the track and sits down to watch. Soon the pilot engine of Lincoln's funeral train passes with long, black streamers and with a band of black instruments playing dirges, grinning skeletons sitting all about. It passes noiselessly, as if it is moonlight. Clouds come over the moon. If it is moonlight, clouds come over the moon as the phantom train goes by. After the pilot engine passes, the funeral train itself, with flags and streamers, rushes by. The track seems covered with black carpet, and the coffin is seen in the center of the car, while all about it, in the air and the train behind, are vast numbers of blue-coated men, some with coffins on their backs, others leaning upon them. If a real train were passing, its noise would be hushed, as if the phantom train rode over it. Clocks and watches always stop as the phantom train goes by, and when looked at is for 5 minutes behind. Clocks and watches always stop as the phantom train goes by, and when looked at are 5 minutes behind. Everywhere on the road about April 27th, watches and clocks are suddenly found to be behind. I read this account in a book of Ohio folklore at my grandparents' house in Gallatin when I was about 5 years old. Directly across the street from their house ran the railroad tracks, and I was convinced that some balmy April evening that black train with its grinning skeleton musicians would glide by before my horrified eyes. Have any of you out there seen it? Mrs. Satan, Madam President. As the first woman candidate for president, Victoria Claflin Woodhull got mixed reviews. In the annals of emancipation, the name of Victoria Woodhull will have its own higher place as a deliverer, says Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The Pittsburgh Leader characterized her as one of the most remarkable, albeit terrible and dangerous women who ever lived. Her enemies called her the Woodhull, a form used for courtesans. She was caricatured by Thomas Nast as Miss Satan, with horns and bat wings, for she espoused free love and the rights of women to decide their own destinies. She herself was convinced that her own destiny was prophesied by her spirit guide. Born in 1838, in Homer, Victoria possessed psychic powers from the time she was a child. It ran in the family. Her mother, Roxana, and her sister, Tennessee, were both healers and mediums. Tennessee, age 5, was nearly run out of town after she predicted a fire in a cemetery too accurately. She also frightened the local children by reading their minds. Victoria's gift appeared at age 3. She fell into a trance after a neighbor died and reported seeing him in the other world. She played with the ghosts of her baby sisters, who had died before she was born. Sometimes she saw the devil who, despite the fact that he hid his face behind a red silk handkerchief, was betrayed by his cloven hooves. In later years, when the Woodhull was at the height of her notoriety, neighbors recalled seeing Victoria, Tennessee, and Roxana stirring a kettle in their backyard, like 3 witches in Macbeth. The opportunistic father, Buck Claflin, who had heard of the sensation that the Rapping Fox sisters were making in Cincinnati, sent the girls to telling fortunes in the parlor of their Mount Gilead boarding house. Indignantly, Victoria told her father that their gifts didn't work that way, that she couldn't just switch the power on and off. "Never you mind," snapped Buck. "Fake it if you have to. Just be sure you give the customers their money's worth." It was in Mount Gilead that Victoria saw her first vision of her spirit guide, a beautiful young man in a dazzling white tunic who brought her a message. "You will know wealth and fame one day," he promised. "You will live in a mansion in a city surrounded by ships, and you will be ruler of your people." Victoria took this prophecy very seriously. During the lean years of her telling fortunes, laying on hands, and hawking her father's herbal concoctions at medicine shows, where her sister Tenny was billed as the Wonder Child. To escape this tawdry life, she married the alcoholic Dr. Woodhull. They moved to Indianapolis, whereas Miss Victoria Chafflin Woodhull, spiritual healer, she quickly became the psychic toast of the town. Victoria made the lame to walk, the deaf to hear, and, incitingly, solved bank robbery. Encouraged by these successes, she moved to Cincinnati and then to Chicago with Tennessee. The Wonder Child has established a magnetic infirmary, proclaimed the placard. The spiteful called it a horse of assassination. Dr. Woodhull had quietly vanished. When the spiritualist Cole Blood came to Victoria for a consultation, she immediately fell into a trance and stated that she and the colonel were destined to marry. According to Victoria, they were betrothed on the spot by the powers of the air. With Blood's encouragement, Victoria was soon elected president of the National Association of Spiritualists. Another move followed, this time to Pittsburgh, where Victoria met once again the beautiful young man in the white tunic. "Go to New York," he said, "to 17 Great Jones Street. There you will find a house ready and waiting for you and yours," he said. Victoria was given a tour of the house in a vision. This time, she was determined to get some answers from the figure. "Who are you?" she demanded. "All these years I have never known. Tell me who you are." The figure stretched out a hand and wrote with his fingers on the tabletop. The letters glowed with a supernatural light. Demosthenes. Just why the noted Greek orator would care about a clairvoyant from Ohio was never explained. But Victoria followed the figure's instructions and went to New York in search of Great Jones Street. In later years, she enjoyed telling how she found the house in her vision at the address given, how she waited in the parlor to discuss renting the house, how she saw a book on the parlor table, stamped in gold in the book's cover on the table, the orations of Demosthenes. She felt a blood-chilling astonishment at the confirmation of her spirit's guide's identity. Tennessee and Victoria blossomed in New York. They opened a brokerage office on Wall Street, known as the Bewitching Brokers. They were the first businesswomen in the history of the market. Through their financial dealings, they became acquainted with Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had taken up spiritualism since the death of his child. Vanderbilt was enchanted by Tennessee and called her "my little sparrow." For her part, she referred to him as "old boy," and turned down his repeated offerings to marriage. Victoria gave Vanderbilt spirit advice on the stock market, but when she conjured up the spirit of his dead wife, the Commodore flatly refused to communicate with her. "Business before pleasure," he ordered. "Let me speak to the late financier Jim Frisk." In Victoria's later years, all of Demosthenes' prophecies seemed about to come true. After all, she had led her people, the spiritualists. The Woodhull was the Equal Rights Party candidate for the president in 1872, advocating a platform of women's suffrage, one sexual standard for men and women, the legalization of prostitution, and of free love. Then something went wrong. She lost the election by a landslide. She exposed Reverend Henry Wallard Beecher's adulteries, was jailed for violating the obscenity statutes, and tried for libel. Desperately denying that she had ever advocated for free love, she married a rich Englishman and died in her sleep at age 88. If she felt that her spirit guide had abandoned her, she did not entirely abandon the spirits. If her daughter Zulu had not survived her, her fortune would have gone to the Society of Psychological Research. U.S. Grant, ESP of the family. 18th President Ulysses Simpson Grant, born at Point Pleasure, was surrounded by women who could predict the future. It was an accepted fact in the Grant family that Julia Dent Grant was psychic. When the Grants were married, Julia declared that she was marrying a future president of the Republic, something that seemed very unlikely given Grant's previous record. Julia's memoirs are filled with psychic dreams and visions. During the Civil War, Julia saw visions of Grant in peril. "When I went to my room to rest for a few moments, when I distinctly saw Ulysses a few rods from me, I only saw his head and shoulders about as high as if he were on horseback. He looked at me so earnestly, and I thought so reproachfully that I started and said, 'Ulysses.' My friend in the next room said, 'Did you call?' And when I told her, she said I was only a little nervous, thinking of him, and I would soon meet him. I started that evening with my little ones. We heard of the Battle of Belmont. However, before we left, Ulysses met me almost before the train stopped. I told him of my seeing him on that day of battle. He asked at what hour, and when I told him, he said, 'That is singular. Just about the time I was on horseback and in great peril. And I thought of you and the children, and what would become of you if I were lost. I was thinking of you, my dear Julia, and very earnestly, too." Julia had a terrible premonition on the day that Lincoln was assassinated. In fact, she prevented her husband from going to the theater with Lincoln, which probably saved his life. In 1871, during Grant's first term in office, the Grants were expected at the reception in Chicago. Julia dreamed of a big bird with smoke arising from its wings and insisted that the family leave the city. Grant thought that she was being fanciful, but they made their excuses and left Chicago, right before the city burned. Grant's sister, Mary Grant Cramer, was a spiritualist and clairvoyant who predicted Julia's death. Says Miss Cramer, "The dream was exceedingly vivid. I thought that Miss Grant came to my bedside and placed her hand on my shoulder, said impressively, 'Mary, I have come to talk to you and to say goodbye, because I'm not going to be with you much longer.'" Miss Cramer told of her dream at the breakfast table the next morning, and was amazed to hear a visiting friend of the family, Miss Catherine Lawrence, say that she too had had a weird dream the night before. She dreamed that she, Miss Cramer, and her sister, Miss Virginia Grant Corbin, were standing together at the door to Grant's tomb on Riverside Drive in New York City. A crowd was gathered, waiting for some kind of procession to arrive. Julia Dent Grant died 8 days later. The New York Sun and other papers carried the story of the prophetic dreams. The Grant's daughter, Nellie, seems to have inherited the family trait, as Julia told in her memoirs. The next morning, Nellie was having her boots laced by the nurse, when she looked up and said, "Mama, when are you going to be home?" Why, Nell," I said, "this is our home. We're going to stay here always. Those nice kind ladies and gentlemen that received us yesterday gave us this nice house to your papa, and this is our home." The Grants had just been presented with a handsome house in Philadelphia. She looked up, rather mystified, I thought, and said, "No, Mama, no. This isn't our home. I've just come from there. Our house is a great, great house," with a struggle to say what it was like the picture in my geography of the Capitol in Washington. "I know, Mama. I was there." No, little girl. This is all ours. You have been dreaming, little one." Grant himself had been seen planning his Civil War strategy at Fort Monroe, Virginia. The Haunted Ring of Miss Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, and his wife Lucy were buried at Spiegel Grove in 1915. While the workmen were moving the caskets, the following curious incident occurred. He, Webb, son of Hayes and Lucy, came to tell me, his cousin, Lucy Elliott Keeler, at the first opportunity, that he found the original caskets almost intact and in excellent condition. The old coffin of Miss Hayes, who died in 1889, sagged open at one end and out rolled in his hands his mother's wedding ring. He showed it to me, engraved with her name from R.B.H. It seemed to me like the last message from Aunt Lucy to this devoted son of hers. The ring is now on display in the museum at Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center. James A. Garfield, our most haunted president? Garfield was possibly our most haunted president. He was born November 19th, 1831, under the sign of Scorpio, whose denizens have a strange fascination with the secrets of life and death. His psychic leanings ran in the family. His grandfather, who was known as James the Astrologer, had great mathematical and clairvoyant gifts. Garfield's mother, Eliza, told the family stories of his uncanny predictions. Garfield's sister, Mary, was also credited by the family with the gift of second sight. All his life, Garfield had an acute sense of his own destiny, torn between orthodox religious beliefs and a certain mysticism. Around 1837, Garfield began to have what he believes were visitations from his dead father's ghost. Like a more benign version of the ghost of Hamlet's father, the spirit advised him on which college to attend. Later, he supposedly told Garfield to accept the command of a volunteer regiment, which he had been offered. In 1851, the intense interest that spiritualists had been generating prompted Garfield to visit a seance in Cleveland, where he asked the medium to contact his father. A series of raps purporting to come from his father, Abram, who died when Garfield was not yet 2, half convinced Garfield that he had indeed communicated with the dead. June, Wednesday 4th, 1851. I went to the Dunham house in Cleveland, where Miss Fish of Rochester, sister of spirit rappers Margaret and Kate Fox, is attending to the spirit knockings, so-called. I paid the doorkeeper $1 and was conducted into the room where the ladies, Miss Fish and 2 others, were. The company, 18 in number, were seated around a table, the ladies sitting at the head. After the company were seated, one of the ladies asked if the spirit would communicate with us by rapping. Immediately the rapping commenced on the settee, or the wall, and then on the table where we were sitting. The manner of proceeding was as follows. An individual first asked if there was any spirits that would communicate with him. If there were, it was indicated by 2 or 3 raps. If the answer was a name, the ladies could call over the alphabet, and when they came to the right letter, it would rap. Or you might write a list of names, and when you came to the right one, it would rap. There were many questions and correct answers infallibly given. I was a perfect stranger to every person in that room. I called for the spirit of my father. It was professed to be an it, responded by rapping. The rapping of no 2 spirits was alike. I asked my father his name. I called over several names, and when the right one was named, it rapped. And this way it told me my own name, that I had one father living, told me his name, and I had one brother in the spirit land, name given, age also, told me how many years father, had been dead. There were many other tests and correct answers. There was intelligence in the answers given to my questions that no persons, not even myself, in the room possessed. So it is impossible that the girl could have made the rapping, for she did not possess the intelligence. 'Tis a mystery, however, and I'll not speculate upon it. Other experiments did not confirm Garfield's belief, and, indeed, he defeated a noted spiritualist in debate. However, he retained a lingering notion that it was indeed possible to communicate with the world beyond. He attended a seance in Eliza's house with her granddaughter, Eliza Tobridge, acting as medium. July, Sunday 18th, 1852. Heard the spirit's rappings at Mother's, Eliza Tolbridge being the medium. Had a long conversation with what purported to be the spirit of my father. He, or it, was pleased with the course I am pursuing, and in regard to study. told past events correctly, but I have no confidence in the prophecies. It said that I would attend school 4 terms more and would be married in 1 year. It also said I would go home again in 3 weeks. With regards to the first, I hope to go more than 4 terms. The second must not be true, and the third I do not expect. Garfield was elected our 20th president in 1880. On his dead father's advice, he set his course to reform the civil service, alienating many of his supporters and causing his own death at the hand of disappointed office-seeker who shot him in 1881. Garfield was one of those numerologically unlucky presidents doomed to die in office when elected at 20-year intervals. William Henry Harrison, 1840, Abraham Lincoln, 1860, Garfield, 1880, William Kinkley, 1900, Warren G. Harding, 1920, Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1940, John F. Kennedy, 1960. Garfield had a premonition that he was going to be killed. He told his fears to a close aide, who later testified that Garfield knew he was a dead man. A few months before the shooting, Garfield took on an insurance policy on his life for $25,000. And only a few days before he was shot, Garfield sent for Robert Lincoln, President Lincoln's only surviving son, and went over every detail of his father's assassination and funeral arrangements. While Garfield was president of Harem College, he lived in a 2-story frame house, where he courted and won Lucretia, Kreitz Rudolph. In the same house, they began their married life together. This house was bought in the 1960s by the Norman family to keep it from being demolished. The Normans think that Garfield, his wife, and friends sometimes return to the house. Normans first experienced electrical and plumbing problems. The dining room light turned on and off as it pleased, and so did water taps upstairs and down. Irritated by the flickering lights, Miss Norman finally snapped, "That's enough of that!" After that, the dining room lights behaved normally. Then the Normans' furniture got into the act. A rocking chair rocking by itself, their pump melodin played and pumped by itself, and a broken cuckoo clock somehow managed to chime. Clocks stopped and lamps came on precisely at 3:20 a.m., although nobody knew why. A puddle of water materialized in front of the family in the dining room. A candle snuffer was seen to fly 12 feet from the mantel where it was lying. The Normans left tape recorders running, which recorded non-existing flute music, raps, and the chiming of invisible glassware. Many people heard these sounds, but the sounds gradually faded off the tapes. Out of curiosity, the Normans called in Charlotte, a local psychic who specialized in automatic writing. At Charlotte's first session, someone wrote in small, dainty handwriting similar to Craig Garfield's. Next time, a spirit named Andrew, who said he represented a whole group of free spirits who knew they were dead but enjoyed coming to the house. Andrew got to be the regular fixture. He asked Joan, the Norman's daughter, to string cranberries and popcorn to the Christmas tree. Thinking it would be charming, old-fashioned touch, she did, even though it took her 3 days. Until she got the strings on the tree, the lights of the Christmas tree flashed on and off, even though they were not the blinking kind. The visiting spirits were apparently not very happy with the Normans' idea about furniture arrangement. The family often found their furniture rearranged. Putting it back made no difference. Somebody kept changing it around. Years later, the Normans read Kreit's diary, quoted the Garfield orbit, which showed that Garfield's furniture had been in those locations. The spirit was disturbed about something more serious than interior decorating. One night during an automatic writing session, a lighted candle flared up into a huge flame. At this, the psychic changed her pen to the left hand, which wrote, "I am James Garfield. If you need proof, look at the candle. I am unhappy because so-called friends had me murdered." Later, the Normans found a crossword puzzle mysteriously filled in by someone who used the odd left-handed E's in Garfield's handwriting. William McKinley returns. William McKinley, 24th President of the United States, born at Niles in 1843, was another president whose assassination generated many premonitions. As though a momentous event like the murder of the head of state created a shock wave in the psychic atmosphere, like the preliminary terrors before an earthquake. In 1900, it was also whispered that the spirits of Queen Victoria and President McKinley were seen in the room where President Lincoln had a prophetic dream about his assassination. Queen Victoria and President McKinley both died within a year. Ohio's own Ambrose Bierce wrote a weirdly prophetic verse when William Goebel, a contender for the governor of Kentucky, was assassinated. The bullet that pierced Goebel's breast cannot be found in all the West. Good reason it is speeding here to stretch McKinley on his briar. This bit of poetic nastiness brought Bierce under suspicion of the murder after McKinley's death. During luncheon the day before his assassination, McKinley asked a waiter uneasily, "What's on the other side of that door?" It was the door he was to walk through to his death. 24 hours after McKinley's death, part-time bartender John Nepomuk Schrack had a grisly dream. In his dream, Schrack saw McKinley rise from his coffin, point an accusing finger at Roosevelt, and name his vice president his murderer. Schrack brooded over this dream for 11 years. On September 14th, 1912, the anniversary of McKinley's death, Schrack was writing a poem when the ghastly ghost of the assassinated McKinley appeared before him. Schrack wrote about his vision. September 15th, 1901, 1:30 a.m. In a dream I saw President McKinley sit up in his coffin, pointing to a man in monk's attire, in whom I recognized as Theo Roosevelt. The dead president said, "This is my murderer. Avenge my death." September 14th, 1912, 1:30 a.m. While writing a poem, someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Let not a murderer take the presidential chair. Avenge my death." I could see clearly McKinley's features. Signed, Innocent Guilty. Schrack ran out and shot Roosevelt, who was wounded, not killed, and insisted on giving his scheduled speech. It was not recorded if McKinley's ghost ever visited Schrack again. "A great life never dies," President McKinley, at the dedication of Grant's tomb, said. McKinley took this pronouncement very personally. Noted for his own oratory when alive, President McKinley spoke after his death at seances held by Judge Albert Mawson, the founder of the GOP in Medina and one of McKinley's staunchest political supporters. Mawson's spirit father, or spirit guide, was his late father, Liam Mawson. His spirit father told Mawson that if he wrote letters to McKinley, replies would come via sealed letters. Medium Anne L. Chamberlain, whose control called her Electa. Medium Anne L. Chamberlain, whose control called herself Electa, was able to summon the spirit of McKinley, who stated that, "I hardly realize the change that has so suddenly to me. I am not dead. I still live. I am too bewildered with astonishment to give expression to my feelings." At this point, Electa broke in to say that McKinley's spirit attendants took him in charge, not permitting him to further interview at this time. He has learned but little as of yet of the spirit life and has many things to unlearn. Through Electa, Munson was told that he had helped McKinley adjust to the afterlife. McKinley also praised Munson warmly for his political support. "You mistake in words, dear Judge, when you say you have a humble heart and a humble part, which should read the most important part in the 1884 campaign. You surely turned the tables for me when I am ever since blessed and honored to you for it." Once fully acclimated, McKinley asked Electra to tell Munson about life in the hereafter. "We have been having glorious festivities lately. Amidst Orienters discoursed to us. An area of many hundred miles was filled with eager listeners, and so clear and lambent was the air that each inflection of the speaker's voice was heard throughout the vast throng. Truly a politician's idea of heaven." The doom of Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding, 28th President of the United States, looked every inch a president. He was a matinee idol, handsome, with imposing head of silver hair, standing 6 feet tall, broad-chested, and possessing an air of simple majesty. When he stood up to make one of his resounding speeches, he was a most impressive figure. But behind this presidential presence was a man of simple tastes, relaxing with his stockinged feet up on his desk, poker with his friends, cold beer on a hot summer day, and pretty girls. Left to himself, he would have stayed a small-town newspaper editor and enjoyed his common pleasures. But his friend and his wife, Florence, had a different idea. Harding found that he had a talent for public speaking, an ability to speak eloquently for hours and say nothing at all. Harding's cronies saw in him more than a good poker partner. They saw a political asset that could take them all the way to the White House. Women had the vote, they reasoned, and being charmingly irrational creatures would cast it for the handsome, courtly senior of Ohio. The political ambitions of Harding's friends were seconded by Florence Kling Harding, a divorcee 5 years his senior. She had prodded the easygoing Harding into marrying her, then insinuated her way into the newspaper staff. Relentlessly, she pushed him into positions higher than his inclinations or talent. She called him Warren. He called her the Duchess, a title she seemed to have accepted in all seriousness as her due. She managed all of his affairs, except those with women, which Harding seemed helpless to resist. The Duchess had a mystic streak that led her to consult psychics about her husband's future. When Harding was running for president, she visited Madame Marcia, a fashionable Washington clairvoyant, who told Mrs. Harding that she was a child of destiny. When the Duchess paid her first incognito visit to the Madame Marcia, she asked the madam to cast a horoscope for a person born November 2nd, 1865 at 2 p.m. Citing a need to consult in spirit, Madame Marcia sent her away and consulted the Congressional Directory. When the Duchess came eagerly to her next visit, Madame Marcia, who knows all, sees all, was able to announce that the man in question would rise to great eminence, that he was sympathetic and kindly, intuitive, free of promises, and trusting to friends, enthusiastic, impulsive, perplexed over financial affairs. Many Clydesdale love affairs, inclined to recreate moods of melancholia, and brooding over those many Clydesdale love affairs. The Duchess wanted to know more. After a little more research, Madame could confidently tell her that if the man born on November 2nd chose to run for president, nothing on earth could stop him being nominated and elected. But, she added darkly, he will not live through his term. It is written in the stars. Following the splendid climax of the House of Preferment, I see the Sun and Mars in conjunction on the eighth house of the zodiac, and this is the house of death, sudden, violent, or peculiar death. Either the Duchess saw this as a small price for Warren to pay for his ambitions, or perhaps she felt it would be ample revenge for those many love affairs. When Harding was nominated for president, the Duchess may have had a qualm or two. To a reporter she exclaimed, "I can see but one word written over the head of my husband, if he is elected, and that word is tragedy." She may have only meant that her husband would be out of his depth in the Oval Office, but the imaginative Gaston means hints that the Duchess foresaw a tragedy of her own making, that she poisoned Harding to save him from being impeached. In The President's Daughter, Nan Brighton, reputedly Harding's mistress and mother of his child, claims to have a premonitory dream of the night of the president's death. Thursday, the 2nd of August, 1923. I dreamed a strange and terrible dream. I was conscious of a something above me that seemed to be floating through the air. What was I seeing? God, a coffin draped with American flags and heaped with red roses. The whole mounting majestically, lifted by an invisible force upwards, onwards, protectingly shrouded by white clouds. So he had come to me, that I might be the first to know he was leaving this earth. He himself tried unto death, lay himself beneath the folds of the crimson flag he had so loved, revealed to me the only symbol of his going, the beautiful cradle of his last restful sleep. Perhaps he had been too tired to bend over me, too tired to even murmur before he went away, "I love you, dearie." But I understood. He meant to waft me sweet kisses in his sleep. The coffin was going upward, heavenward, away from me, oh God, no, not away. Even if one transfixed I lay, moving only pitifully frightened eyes to watch the coffin fade slowly out of sight, protectingly enveloped in the white, white clouds.